Archetypes have been an important part of fighting games ever since they first gained a character select screen in Street Fighter 2. Even if you don't fully understand the idea of a Shoto, you probably know all about the more commonly discussed Grappler and Zoner. But why do archetypes exist? Just how many archetypes are there? How do you know who fits into an archetype? And what actually is an archetype anyway? Let's start with answering the why. There's two reasons for archetypes: the developer end and the player end. On the developer end of things, variety is the spice of your game. Street Fighter 1 versus mode was okay, but repeated mirror matches gets repetitive fast. Having 8 characters gives you 64 matchups, so that's like 64 times the content that Street Fighter 1 has, so that's cool. But characters do actually need to be sufficiently different for that to matter. In the original Street Fighter 2, Ken's actually identical to Ryu, his throw is just slightly different, so let's just make that a 7x7 grid. 49 times the content in Street Fighter 1 is still pretty good, all things considered. And the reason that distinction needs to even be made is that the reason differences between the characters matter is the player's end of the why. Archetypes are all about player understanding and knowledge transfer. People weren't throwing out terms like Zoner and Grappler when there was only one fighting game with a character select. But as the arcade multiplied and this matchup grid went from 49 entries to 2025, it started to be necessary for players to go into games knowing the types of characters they like to play, and how to play against certain characters. So if I play a Zoner in one game, and you play a Grappler, I still get to keep my game plan even if my move list is different, as is yours. I don't want to introduce anything into the argument that anyone might disagree on here, since archetypes are supposed to be a widespread and replicable concept. So let's use a certainty for example's sake. Zangief has remained a grappler in every game he's been in, and you'd be really hard pressed picking a strange hill to die on if you tried to argue that for some reason he wasn't a grappler. But over the years, Zangief has both lost and gained tools. In some games, he's an absolute beast at dealing with zoning. He can just clap projectiles out the air and close distance like it's nothing. While in other games, it's much more of a constant struggle to close the gap, and he has a really hard time getting in. That changes his playstyle a lot. Your responses to things has to change, but his archetype doesn't change from this. So what happens if we then remove, say, his grabs? Besides making the world whole again, I think anyone with half a brain would say that this actually does make him no longer a grappler. Not only is the definition of the word grappler inclusive of throwing, but it would change his goals as a character significantly. If he's not trying to get in to grab you anymore, he just hits you. All he could really do is dodge projectiles and smack you with his big arms. It's a much weaker and less defined game plan. But what about Dhalsim? If you removed Yoga Fire, his legs and fists still stretch to fill the heavens. So it's not any singular move you can alter to make him not a zoner anymore. But what if you just gave him normal character's range on everything he has? He still has all of his moves, but they aren't full screen anymore. Well, it'd be silly to call him a zoner in that case, since he would have no way to prevent approach or to cause active harm to someone running away from him. Instead, he has to close distance, get in, and attack like anyone else. It's not the goal of this video to say what exact archetype you would call Ren and Stimpy when you got rid of their respective archetypes, but this example was to note that clearly there's a wide range of things that define archetypes. For some characters, it can actually be a singular move, whereas for others, it's the properties of their whole moveset. So I think an archetype comes down to something that I'd like to call facilitation, how a character defines and reaches their own goals. But before I explain what that actually means, I'd like to explain why we even need this concept to define archetypes. Let's remember that matchup spread from earlier. In KOF 98, there's 45 characters, if you exclude the EX variants of existing ones, which leads to 2025 matchups that I showed earlier. Since for any one of these characters, there's 45 different matchups. Can a single character be a different archetype in all 45 of these? Well, that depends entirely on what you define an archetype as, but I think quite clearly things get very ridiculous very quickly if your game winds up with you needing to remember 2025 different archetypes in the case of each and every matchup. 45 would already be a lot to ask. And that's without asking the question, are there 45 different archetypes in this game? 3 archetypes? 1? Let's remember the why that we discussed earlier. Archetypes as a concept came into use because they describe transferable knowledge from one game to another. Fighting games are not all completely different from one another, and even the most different fighting games possible still have many overlapping concepts. So we want the concept of an archetype to be replicable. An archetype can't be so specific that it only describes Nakaruru, but it should also be precise enough that players feel it actually does allow knowledge to be transferred between characters and between games. If the definition of a grappler is so wide that it includes both Guile and Zangief, it becomes very hard to apply any specific strategy to playing as grapplers or playing against them. These characters play way too differently from one another, so we have to look for something specific to only some characters, and something that does not change depending on the opponent at the time. So ideally, we need a way to define these characters looking at them in a vacuum, entirely on their own and outside of the moment to moment of a particular matchup. So what makes a character on its own that we can look at to build up this idea of facilitation? Well, characters in fighting games are made up of many attributes. Their visuals, their speed, their damage, their range, and their move attributes. Visuals affect the least mechanically, but it does come into things. Even ignoring just hitbox size, there's stuff like Susano's command grab using the same animation as his dash, specifically to confuse you as to what he's doing. But some other characters can either have hard to anticipate and react to animations, or completely clear and simple ones, which can also tie slightly into their speed. Speed covers all elements of a character that could be fast: their attacks, their recovery, their movement, etc. The character's damage is self-explanatory. How much damage did their moves do, and how much damage can that character take? Both apply. And least self-explanatory of all is move attributes. There's too huge a list for me to get into, but some moves destroy projectiles, some hit overhead or low, some have armor or are invincible. There's just tons of possible move attributes, but they help paint an overall picture of what this character's facilitating, showing you how this character defines and then reaches their own goals, which I think then ultimately decides which archetype a character belongs to. Let's bring back Zangief and Dhalsim, since again, no one's going to disagree on their archetypes, and let's see how their goals are derived. Both characters have low speed for both their attack and their movement. Gief has a large hitbox, while Dhalsim's is about average. Gief's range is his arm's length, while Dhalsim's range is his arm's length. And where they start to get noticeably different is their damage spread. Gief's damage for his regular attacks is actually pretty average, but his command grab is a quick 50 damage, while his regular attacks are roughly 15, so that's triple the reward for a grab than a normal attack. Meanwhile, for Dhalsim, basically everything does somewhere between 15 to 20 damage, while Yoga Fire does an exceptional 30 damage, which is between double and 50% more reward depending on which range you're talking about. And as for special attributes, Zangief can spin through projectiles and his command grab cannot be teched and has to be jumped out of or interrupted. Meanwhile, Dhalsim has basically no special attributes to speak of. His projectiles dissipate against other projectiles as anyone might expect, and none of his moves have armor. The closest thing to an attribute that he has is that his slide goes under projectiles. But besides that, nothing special. So, let's look at Zangief closer. His biggest reward is his grab by far. It's so much more rewarding that it's worth more than 3 attacks. He's slow, and he's a big target, which are downsides that counteract this potentially explosive damage he gets if he does get into close range. And his double lariat helps him close the distance and punish projectiles, or he can just get to a place where he can actually hit the opponent. All of these things are contributing factors to his archetype, because these facts all facilitate a certain game plan, which is the struggle to get in with his poor mobility and big body that then is paid off with a huge health bar nuke as a reward. And that is how we would all collectively conceptualise grapplers in the wider sense. There's subtypes of grappler too, but that's for another episode of Archetype Archive. In fairness, Zangief is a very easy case study for his archetype. He has very explicit move properties that make his move purposes very clear. You don't have to imply anything except what they tell you in the data. The facilitation here can be done with a spreadsheet with just raw numbers, and he's a very simple version of a grappler. The simplest version in fact. He has no jumping DDTs or anything special for him. Defining an archetype starts to get complicated when stuff does need to be implied and not just read off of a table, which I think Dhalsim is a very good example of. If you just use the same primary method I just used for Zangief and looked at the damage table, you'd assume Yoga Flame is all Dhalsim cares about, which is funny because it's actually his closest range tool and is one of his most specific ones. It's not really a zoning tool, it's not a great anti-air, and it's probably his least used attack. Obviously this is working from back to front, but if your archetype definition doesn't wind up counting Dhalsim as a zoner, it has failed. So clearly, just the spreadsheet for damage doesn't work alone. Dhalsim's goal, as any player could describe, is not just to hit Yoga Flame as often as possible, but to hit with his furthest range tools as consistently and as far away as possible. So that's why I came up with Facilitation as the prime factor in what causes a character to be a certain archetype in the first place, because you can't just look at only one set of things, like movement, design, damage, range, move attributes, etc., and instead you need to look at the character as a whole. So for Facilitation, the prime method to showcase an archetype is this. What does it look like if a character does everything they can do all at once? This gets insanely complicated for modern fighting games with bigger move lists, but on Dhalsim this makes placing his archetype really easy. It even makes the purpose of Yoga Flame obvious. Its startup is way slower than its kicks, but it lasts a lot longer than them. It's a lingering hitbox to catch people in that's too slow to be used on reaction to anything specific, but it can be used predictively to hit someone who thinks they're jumping out of the way of grounded options or is just trying to get into Dhalsim's no-no zone. This even got reinforced in Turbo and beyond, where he gained an anti-air version of this move. But this is the best way I find to look at a character on paper, since as we established we can't just use matchups to decide or we wind up with 20-25 archetypes per game. With this method, if you need to see how this character works in certain situations, you can just look at this altogether move spread with a bunch of on and off switches. Asking, what if there's a projectile is valid, and you can see immediately that Dhalsim only has 3 options that even interact with projectiles. Everything else would just leave him getting hit. What is active after 3 frames? Well, not much. What if he's being grabbed? Well, he gets grabbed. What can he do after being knocked down? Essentially nothing. Obviously you can test this against insanely specific stuff, like what can Dhalsim do against Akuma Air Fireball, but we're here to try look at Dhalsim in a vacuum. And noting that he doesn't have any invincible reversal for Wake Up is easy without testing him in a match against E Honda to see. So we can see just looking at this huge overlay of full screen fists and feet that he's a zoner. His long range attacks send people far away if he hits with them, and his coverage of the entire screen means all angles of approach are covered and they're defensible with correct play from Dhalsim. He doesn't have an instant win condition, nor does he have any specific moves that reward him for holding certain angles, but all of his moves further this goal of keep away, and he's happy getting relatively average damage in that process. Let's accept that, and let's look at someone just a bit more complicated to round this theory off, and show just how I come to these decisions. Let's look at Ryu. If Ryu does everything all at once, it's much more eclectic looking than Dhalsim. It's very different. I'm of course simplifying things on screen, but none of Ryu's normals are too extraordinary for this purpose. He has many tools though with specific purposes that only win in specific scenarios. DP wins against jumping or on wake up. Hadoken hits people on the ground. Tatsu wins against projectiles. All his specials have a clear single purpose. If he's pressuring anyone, he doesn't have notable mix-ups. His combos are short and sweet and his damage is average, but he has an answer for any situation, and he has just one valid answer. He's not overly reliant on being close or far, and he's not notably slow or fast. He's very average. If I had to name him, he'd be a Swiss Army character or something. He has a tool for every situation, but just one tool for those situations. He's not uniquely great at anything, but he's always capable. This is the set of ideas that winds up defining the Shoto. They can handle every situation, but they're not particularly great at it. They're just average. And I'd like to note that this idea of facilitation still applies to anything about a character that isn't just their moves too. I used SF2 for example's sake, but things like how much damage do all these buttons combo into, how safe are they on block, can this character triple air dash, do they cross up or create ambiguous situations, all of that can be factored into this view of a character's archetype. But the point is, you can still do that on a silhouette of a character, and your examples don't need to be in any way matchup specific, while still not ignoring any specific factors of what a character can and can't do. What position does this move create? How many attacks are we in range of after this move is blocked? How much of their move list is special cancelable? Do all their moves push them forward or backwards? You can see just using this analysis of a character, a pretty good idea of what they do and their strengths and their weaknesses. What scenarios do they want to be in and which do they not? This lets you both tell what archetype they're in and what archetype they're not, because it gives you a very clear picture of the things that a character excels at, and in turn that lets us be rid of silly statements like Ryu is a zoner when he's fighting Zangief. And in general, it allows you to remove a lot of doubt when you see a character that you think could be one archetype but could also be another. It's about this overall picture that everything about that character paints, and if that game plan, where they find their momentum, is found mirrored in other fighting games, and you as a player can recognise that multiple characters are geared towards trying to do the same thing, independent of how you play the game or your opponent. I hope that gave you guys a good idea of what goes into defining an archetype, and I'm so sorry for the wait for this video. Not only did I want the editing to lean a little more towards the infographic style that I typically take in my manga reviews, since this was a much more informational topic than usual, but you guys had also left hundreds of comments that I want to be sure this video addressed, while also covering any loopholes I could find in common definitions of archetypes or any misconceptions that were floating around about them. Coming up with this method for defining facilitation served the dual purpose of helping you guys at home figure out exactly where certain characters lie, or defining easier the lines which you disagree with me across. Defining strict definitions for broad and airy concepts like this can be difficult, but I did my very best to be precise and thorough as I could be, and to leave off with a very complete picture that could be applied to any individual character, with a method that will easily showcase all of their strengths and their weaknesses. Hopefully that should be it for big concept videos for a while, and we have plenty more Archetype Archive coming soon. Now that this explanation is complete, I can move on to some special announcements. Every month I'm going to try and cover something big, while covering some minor archetypes on the side. This month I'm going to be covering the Shoto, my very first of the big 4 main archetypes. Since I'm going to be as thorough as I can be and cover a lot of the controversy surrounding this archetype and how difficult it is to define, I'll be making some more minor archetype archives that you can look at as similar to the regular videos. To support this longer video process, I'm now opening my Patreon at patreon.com/darumafgc, where you can vote and have your say in what archetypes I cover next, along with a lot of other goodies, like early access to my videos and some behind the scenes posts, having your name in the credits of future videos, or even a direct shout out of your username, or some alias you'd prefer that I'm allowed to say out loud. The response to these videos really has been overwhelming, but I'm doing my best to still provide you guys with quality content at a reasonable frequency. To celebrate that, and as a nice treat for you guys for waiting patiently for this video, another special episode of Archetype Archive is coming tomorrow. This one's on the Boxer, one I thought you guys would really enjoy. Very shortly after these videos go live, I'll be putting my first poll up on Patreon for the next Archetype Archive, but the archetypes to choose from aren't set in stone quite yet, so you guys at home can sound off as loud as you can in the comments about what archetypes you want covered, and even if you can't support me via Patreon, your requests have a very high chance of appearing on polls either right now or in future months following this video. That's going to be all for this episode of Archetype Archive, but as always, if you liked the video, leaving a like and subscribing really helps the channel grow, and in turn leads to me being able to dedicate even more of my time to these videos and responding to you guys in the comments. I have a lot of fun trying to answer your questions, and some of the discussions you have amongst yourselves have been super interesting too. As always, I'll just round off by saying, stay safe.